Hey, everybody, welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism. 43 events, 110 speakers, as Al Pacino would say, wow. So I want to clue you into some of the events that are coming up so you can catch them. Today, in fact, we have another event that's going on. Whoops, I think the time is wrong on that. What do we have on the website? It's theorizing the revolutionary foresight of Black communist women with Jody Dean, Ashley Farmer, and as the moderator, and Charisse Burden-Stelly. And that's at 6 p.m. 6 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific time. Boy, I'm really screwing this up today. All right, and tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. we have Spectre presents Spectre Journal, new, 2 years old radical journal, is going to take us through the Paris Commune, which is 150 year has reached this 150-year anniversary. Of course, everybody knows that Lenin danced up and down in Russia in 1917 when he said, "We've lasted longer than the Commune." You can read that any way you will. For Red May's political line here. And that will have Stathis Kubilakis, Carolyn Eichner, and Zach Levinson as the moderator. At 3 p.m., Translating Marx. A new translation of Marx is the title of the panel. And Paul North and Paul Ryder are doing a new translation of Volume 1 of Capital. And the moderator will be Ever Osorio Ruiz. Tomorrow at 11 a.m., it's another anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Nanni Ballestrini's We Want Everything. So the panel is called We Still Want Everything. And we have Rachel Kushner, Maria Teresa Carboni, Franco Bifo Berardi, and Jasper Burns as the moderator. And coming back at 2 p.m. tomorrow, Spectre Journal is giving us another panel, which is called Class Struggle and Racial Justice After the Union Drive at Amazon in Alabama. We'll go over what happened there and what we can expect in the future. We've got Donna Murch and Michael Goldfield. David McNally will moderate. So lots of good stuff coming up before we take our 2-day pause for breath and go in our last stretch here. You may wonder, or even if you don't wonder, I will tell you how we do all this, what kind of institutional support we get. Well, we get none. I mean, be a commie for enough is a slogan that doesn't attract much in the words, in the nature of institutional support in America. So I'm going to say it, we depend on you. You can donate. You look at our YouTube description, you'll see a link there that to fan the flames of Red May, our GoFundMe, or you can go to our website where there will be a link to GoFundMe, and we also have a Patreon at $3, $5, $10, and $20 a month levels. Lots of ways to be generous. We depend on your generosity. But without further ado, I want to get to the day's event. And we're happy to welcome another new journal, Lux, a socialist-feminist women's journal. How do you start one like that? Well, today we are going to find out. And we have a lot of the editors here, but I want to introduce you to Red May's moderator, Kathi Weeks, the author of The Problem with Work, Constructing Female Subjects, professor of gender studies, women's studies at Duke University. Kathi? It's yours.
Thanks, Philip. So I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel about a journal that I'm already a big fan of, and it's brand new. And we're going to talk about the project of Lux magazine. And one of the taglines is a new magazine of feminism for the masses. It's sex with class. And there are other great taglines too that gives you kind of a flavor of the seriousness and cheekiness at the same time of the magazine. So we have 5 of the editors and designers with us to talk about the project today. Sarah Leonard, Marian Jones, Tammy Kim, Cheryl Rivera, and Sharanya Durvasula. Sorry. And so we're going to start. I'm going to ask Sarah to just say a few things about the magazine to introduce it. And then I've got a few questions to get us started with the conversation. And then we'll take questions also from the audience. So Sarah, go ahead.
Well, it's really great to be here, and thanks for having us. And it's especially great that we get to have you as our moderator, because the problem with work definitely helped shape my brain, and I know many other people's as well. So to give the magazine a little introduction, this is the magazine. This is Lux, and so we really wanted to create a socialist magazine that was feminist, abolitionist, queer from the jump, and also to create something that was a pleasure to read, which for us is a political choice as much as an aesthetic one, and that's something we'll talk about. We do original reporting, we do culture writing, we do political analysis, and we've started in our first issue with also quite a lot of international coverage. From Mexico, where we wrote about community reparations as a model for responding to rape, to Cairo, where we wrote about creating gender-neutral pronouns in Arabic at a time when political censorship is raising a lot of questions about language in general, to the UK, where we wrote about how a website for moms got turned into a site of like virulent anti-trans politics. So our first issue has, I'm used to saying it just came out, but it sort of just came out. And actually, if you subscribe now, we're in like the last couple of weeks to subscribe and get the inaugural issue, which is really gorgeous. And so we encourage you to do that. And our next one will be out in June. We're all crashing the close right now. So that's a little bit about Lux.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So I've just got a whole bunch of questions, and I'm going to start with this one, and just, jump in as you see fit. So you described Lux as a kind of a radical makeover of a traditional women's magazine, a glossy magazine too, which I love that part. So I guess my first question is like, why do you want to remake that genre of the women's magazine rather than throw it out with the dustbin of history? And I'm thinking in particular about, there's an essay that Gloria Steinem wrote, of all people, and it was in the issue of Ms. Magazine that came out after it went from being a magazine that takes ads to a subscription only magazine. And with the new issue of the new version of it, she wrote this article about what it was like over the years trying to get advertisers to sign on to Ms. Magazine, and just how difficult it was, in part because they demanded complimentary copy. So if they were going to, advertise makeup, they were not happy with showing a woman without makeup on another page in their story. And they didn't want to talk about rape and things like that, because they wanted to sell products and they wanted people to feel good. And it was just such a struggle over these years to try to get advertisements. She says, and that's why traditional women's magazines look the way they do, is because of, what advertisers were demanding in some ways. So I guess I'm still thinking about, what are the ongoing attractions to this form, this thing called the women's magazine, the glossy magazine? What are the pleasures of the genre that make you want to kind of take it and radically remake it rather than just chuck it?
I just want to say that for me, when I was pitched this project and I was told that it was a glossy women's magazine, I love that from an aesthetic perspective. I think we were not really entirely publishing articles that I think a typical women's magazine, the Cosmopolitan, would do. I think that our tone is very cheeky, borrowing from it. We have, for example, in our next issue, we're doing a what's in her bag. And this was an article idea that we talked about for a really long time, because I think that as women, there's something viscerally interesting in other women. I truly believe that when, even the way that we dress and style ourselves, we really do it to speak to other women. And so I think seeing what's in her bag, we thought that approaching something like that with a sex worker or, you know, a nurse or someone, an organizer, you know, having a leftist perspective to it would actually be funny. I don't think that it's something that we are really trying to, you know, follow to a mold, but it's just a kickoff point for us. And then I think stylistically, the way that the magazine is laid out too, I think we sort of borrow from these things because they feel familiar, but they allow us to sort of round out our voice a little bit. Yeah, and I think when we started, what you're saying about advertising, that was something that something that we talked about a lot, because traditional women's magazines are so aspirational, and a lot of that is because of sales and luxury sales, you know. So I think that all magazines are aspirational, whether or not they say they want to be. So I think that for us making Lux, thinking about these things, the real moment that we aspire to is sort of imagining the future that we want. You know, which I think doesn't shy away from opulence or luxury, and imagining, you know, as we say, luxury for all. But what does that visually look like, you know? And I think a lot of magazines that we're used to, their audience is not women, it's everybody, which is great. But I think for us specifically, speaking to women, wanted to make something that felt more feminine, or something that had bright colors, and something that was maybe a little edgier, sometimes softer, and kind of said and had all these emotions with pride. So I think that was something aesthetically, I think, that we took from a women's magazine, but I don't think that ultimately at the end of the day, it's that we are trying to follow it to a T.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to add on top of that, when I got involved in the project, you know, Sarah always likes to talk about how she grew up reading women's magazines, and I don't know, I've always found that to be just like cute and like endearing thing about her, because I don't know, Sarah's maybe the type one wouldn't expect to grow up reading women's magazines, given her feminism. The other aspect that I liked about it was creating a magazine that is so accessible to people, instead of, you know, these magazines on the left, it can be very black and white and very dry, and we need the theoretical stuff, but making a magazine that's fun and accessible really appealed to me as someone who kind of came from poly-ed and likes to learn about the left. So I think making as many gateways for people to get into the left as possible is good. And while Sharanya was talking, another thing I thought about is the fact that women's magazines are a really successful thing, or, you know, they continue to do well as like print media has gone bad. People still like the physical magazine in hand, and for that reason, women's magazines have to be a really beautiful thing, because you have to hold it and look at it and want to buy the physical copy because it looks nice. So I think that's another thing I like about Lux, is how pretty our magazine is. But yeah, I love the question about why it's a women's magazine. I think it's my favorite thing about Lux. I think it's very funny that we're in that genre. So.
Yeah, I really think a lot about like how guided we are by what does it mean to like have a good life, like as a socialist. What does that mean? These magazines are like culture making, women's magazines, shaping like what it meant to have luxury and pleasure and like good stuff in life. And so to reconceive of this like in a socialist way, what does it mean to have a good life? Because I think all socialists are fighting to have good lives, right? We're not fighting to live in a future of drudgery, but I think we have to figure out what does that look like and reframe things like luxury and pleasures. What does it mean to have pleasure in the collective? What does it mean to have like a politics that's integrated with your life? What does it mean to like live as a socialist? I think all of these are part of like what women's magazines did, was tell you what does it mean to live as like, I don't know, a woman under capitalism. I guess we're saying, what does it mean to live a good life as a socialist? Something to explore.
Well, okay, sorry. I feel like I'm talking a bit, but another thing that I think is really funny about Lux being a women's magazine is, Sharanya said this a little bit, but the content of women's magazines, it'll be like fashion advice, weight loss advice, how to attract guys. So just taking that and wanting to do like a feminist spin on that is funny. I don't know. I just wanted to add that as well. there's layers to why it's funny, I think is what I'm saying.
I mean, notably, traditional women's glossies are designed to make you feel bad. So you'll buy stuff to feel better. And this is like the opposite. It's sort of, welcoming you into a community. You already have the capacity to be involved in politics. You already have the capacity to, join the community that is Lux. You don't have to buy something to be part of this community, which is aspirational in a sense. It's politically aspirational. And the door is really open to everybody. We have a sort of jokey recurring feature in our newsletter where we recommend a product to you, but the thing is always free. I think it's natural to think aspirationally and to want more beautiful things, a better world, a better life, but to reframe that in a way that is socialist, that is political. Yeah.
Well, there's so much to talk about, and I want to do it all at once, but no, I'm going to do it step by step. So to try to get at what you're doing here, we need to talk about the luxury glossy part. I definitely want to talk about that, some of the stuff that Cheryl was talking about, and explore that more. But I was wondering if, just to kind of, for people who are new to this project, how would you situate Lux in relationship to a kind of recent proliferation of left and often feminist friendly publications? And, so I'm thinking of Jacobin, I'm thinking of Viewpoint, Pinko, also Spectre, an explicitly Marxist feminist magazine, and even maybe Teen Vogue. I don't know, so there's all these very different, and, some of them are explicitly feminist, some are, more or less feminist friendly. And so I was wondering how you see Lux's compatibilities or maybe differences with these other journals. Part of it is that it's explicitly feminist. And so if that's key to how you're distinguishing it, what's the importance of feminism now? I teach feminism, but sometimes I still feel that it's constantly almost feeling a little passé. And feminists keep chugging along, but why feminism? Why? It's also queer and abolitionist and trans affirming and the rest, but why specifically feminism? So could you talk a little bit about how you conceive the project in relationship to maybe some of these others, and why the feminism but not the way that Spectre's doing it, for example?
I can maybe start with a small piece of the answer, which is one of the things that's really interesting about political media is each publication or podcast brings a new group of people into a political world and helps them understand themselves politically, their identity as politically formed, and what actions might follow from that. And I've heard of plenty of people finding their way to political organizations, organizing, because they read a magazine or listened to a podcast or followed someone on Twitter. This is a very normal way to enter into politics. And if none of those publications are focused on your experience as a sort of gendered person in the world, that's actually missing a huge swath of the experience that politicizes people. And if we want people, especially women, especially queer folks, non-binary folks, to feel like, oh, I belong on the left, I see a gateway for me to enter into the left, I see people like me within the left, we must have that gateway. Otherwise, the left is going to look a certain way and have certain very obvious problems. The selfish version of that is, I cannot imagine a community I would more want to be part of than the one that I think has begun to form around this magazine, with this particular magazine's point of view. And I think that's very, very important. And something like Spectre, we adore Spectre and talk with them about politics, and they're very consciously doing more theoretical work. Their magazine is taking more of a journal form. And so I always read Spectre. It informs my thinking. And we're working in sort of a different format that hopefully is forming that sort of bridge. Both a community for people who are within the left and sort of a really wide open door for people who might not already be.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. I came to this project relatively late compared to the rest of these wonderful people on the call. And I think this is a query I had for the team. And the first thing I think Sarah said, which I found great, was, well, there should be a lot of these, which is a great answer. Like, for the reason that she articulated, which is that everyone has their own entry point, but also because I think everybody is, not everybody will see all of these different things. And for me, I feel like in my reading life, I just mentally have this kind of thing where I expect all the left and political stuff to feel like broccoli and to kind of have this very sort of academic vibe. And I know what it's kind of going to look like typographically and what it's going to feel like coming into my head. And to me, Lux blows that up. Lux is saying, like, here's something that's this kind of small, beautiful object that you can carry around in your pocket that has tons of cheeky, silly stuff in it that lets you laugh and just be ridiculous, but will also kind of like slowly hold your hand and, take you through this. But, even I think our more serious features, the editors have worked hard to sort of shape them into a way that is very accessible for people who don't come in with like some sort of, committed ideology. I think we also consider ourselves pretty broad tent in our feminism. And so, I think that is really important. Like, I feel comfortable handing a copy of Lux to a range of different people I can think of in my life, many of whom actually wouldn't necessarily say, first off, oh yeah, I'm a socialist feminist, but they wouldn't disagree either with a lot of the ideas presented in the magazine.
Yeah, I think all of those publications we're in conversation with, and that the goal is to expand conversation. Once again, I just think culture making is super important for the left. There's so much media out there that really doesn't have a socialist perspective. And so I think that field should be really widened. There should be much more publications there, much more conversations happening with each other, because that kind of like collective struggle together through like the media we consume, through this like ecosystem we build, I think was really what's gonna turn the tide for socialists. I think it's really important. And so I think of Lux as like an experimentation in form, because we must experiment with all the forms that our socialist media is coming in, see what fits, what sticks, what can be flipped, what works. I think you really got to throw like everything at the wall. And so I think we're trying to see, like, for a variety of reasons, like humor, it's kind of fun, it's cheeky, pleasure, beauty. If this form is one of those that works, these experimentations that work. I mean, I think already, yes, it has. First issue is great. You guys should read some of those pieces we dropped in the chat. But yeah, I see it as like an experimentation and like widening this field of like socialist, like media, socialist conversation with each other, socialist thought building. Got to build some thoughts to undergird the actions.
So it's a big tent. It's a wide open door. You're, Sarah and the rest of you are talking about how, it's a gateway in for a lot of people. And, you describe it as, a new magazine for the masses. And I'm wondering who the masses are, like, and how do you, like, because maybe you guys, I don't know if you have a full answer for this at this point, because I guess this is an ongoing project, but, so often, and I'm thinking, again, traditional women's magazines just spoke down to their readers. And then sometimes when I read other left magazines, I feel like unless you read everything Hegel ever written, you won't get it. And so how do you navigate that? Like, how do you navigate it so it's not too simple? Because sometimes I think editors, when I'm trying to write something that's not for an academic audience, I just feel that they're asking me to dumb it down, and I don't think readers want that. Readers are super capable, and yet sometimes the jargon, it can be really off-putting, and it doesn't invite people in. So I just wondered, like, how do you negotiate that? Like, how do you make this, because your contents are really sophisticated and you're dealing with difficult and complicated issues, and yet you want it to be accessible. And I don't know how you're thinking about that, or is that an ongoing kind of problem? Is that something where do you end up talking about, well, I think this one worked and this one didn't? And when people are pitching articles, do you have advice for how to kind of cast it so it's open and inviting and accessible to people who are new to some of these concepts and debates, but also, you guys are dealing with really difficult, complicated content. So I just wondered how you're negotiating that or navigating it.
Yeah, I'm really curious to know what other people think. I feel like we haven't had this conversation about, well, we have had some conversations about trying to make things accessible from different points of views, but I think that for the most part, I think it's possible to use jargon and potentially define your terms, or to maybe not necessarily use jargon where it's not appropriate, or where it's not appropriate, where you can use a different word that's more accessible. But yeah, I view Lux, not as a journal, so it's not as beholden to. Sorry, Philip's comment in the chat. So it's not as beholden to the rigors of an academic text. Bell Hooks, who's not a leftist, kind of comes to mind in that she writes really accessible and interesting ideas. So I think of, but yeah, I have yet to see, or we have yet to have that conversation around, will our readers understand this or that? So I'm curious to know what Sarah and others think about this question.
I feel like I am our reader. I don't know, I'm a person who reads the magazine. My friends are, and I wasn't sure if it was Hegel or Hegel, and very recently it was, it's not my forte. So I certainly feel if it happened, and what does your editorial room look like? Ours looks like one where I'd be like, I don't understand this at all. And that's probably something we talk about. But I think because of what it looks like with our editors and the audience we're looking for are people like us, people we're not trying to talk down to, but who we're having like a conversation with. These are our peers. I think it's somewhat intuitive to navigate like what feels like it's accessible. Because we have a lot of different people in the room. And it's not it doesn't feel like an environment where sometimes you get a bunch of people who all like took the same course and we're all part of the same like publication together forever. And, and they've got a very like uphold whatever thought sort of like group mentality. And it doesn't feel that way in the Lux editorial Slack. We don't have a room, we have a Slack.
I also make my youngest sister read the issue cover to cover. She's in college and she's like smart and not part of any kind of like Marxist political bubble. And I actually asked her to read all of it. And she would just like call me periodically and be like, okay, I loved this one. Okay, this one had terms I didn't understand. And it was really interesting. I mean, I think, I really agree with everything Cheryl said, which is that hopefully we have created for ourselves an environment where we can ask questions and different ones of us will identify different things as like not making sense or not working. And also trying to get other people to do that for us in order to make sure that we're expressing ourselves as clearly as possible. Because I think that's all it comes down to, I think it's writing as clearly as possible And we would never talk down to the audience because, you know, as others have already said, the audience is us. And we're making something that we like, you know, like who can we condescend to? I mean, it's sort of like a gross idea. I remember being in college and being determined to read Gramsci because someone had invited me to my first Marxist reading group, and I was like, yeah, okay, I'm gonna do it. And the thing that was set to read was Perry Anderson's Antinomies of Antonio Gramsci in New Left Review. And I almost never read Marxism again. I was like, it was, in many ways, I look back now, I'm like, okay, that's an important article. In other ways, it was so unhelpful to anyone who was not already starting from a certain very high level of knowledge. And it didn't have to be that way. There was no reason for it to be that way. This is an article written about the person who invented the idea of the organic intellectual, you know, the person who didn't have to go to school in order to think, and whose thinking was informed by experience in a concrete sort of way. And I think for us, there's just, you know, I think it's safe to say that our political analysis, our ideas about organizing, and many people on this call do far more organizing than I do, you know, intellectual work is useless if it's not useful to people who are actually doing things. And so if you put a barrier between the reader and the information, it's just defeating the point of the project, really.
I wonder if Sharanya and our design folks would have thoughts on this as well, in terms of how to use, you know, other forms of expression, other media to, you know, convey these complicated ideas. And, you know, I think one thing I was just going to quickly mention is that I think, in contrast again to kind of more academic left-wing journals, we have the benefit of certain genres that already have in them, you know, this kind of accessibility to understand complex sort of theories or, you know, ideas. So, you know, if we can do reported features, we can do personal essays, you know, these media that just in their sort of like formal construction of what they are, allow us to, you know, avoid using complex vocabularies, et cetera, but to convey complex ideas through storytelling. We are also, as I think, you know, some of the folks mentioned, we're very interested in organizing, and through profiling organizers, doing interviews with organizers and stuff, we can allow them to speak for themselves and sort of tease out their own ideas. So I think to that extent, we are kind of playing with form to relay this sort of content.
Thanks, Tammy. You know, earlier I was mentioning that we're doing like a "What's in Her Bag" feature, and I think personally for me, and then this is something that we talked about before, I would actually really love to see more pieces like that in the magazine that actually introduce more culture, or if you will, lifestyle because I think that in a way that is part of women's magazines. That is something that people have this sort of kind of undeniable drawn interest to. And I think that experimenting with the form and the way that we all approach this from different backgrounds and try to, you know, give it a leftist practice, I think that these forums end up taking a new life and like telling a more complicated story. But yeah, I think that, you know, we're also just getting started. And, you know, you asked about pitches before, and it's hard. It's been really hard because we get a lot of pitches, I think, that are for lack of a better term, like traditional, you know, they're like a classic feminist outlook. Whereas I think that sometimes we try to, I don't know, come from an angle that feels more luxe, whatever that might be, because it's, I don't know, we're still developing it. But yeah, I don't know. I think that we're still trying to get somewhere in our practice.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, is what's more luxe, you know, but I guess it's under construction right now at this point too. But one of the things that definitely feels like new to me and really exciting, and you've talked about this a little bit, Cheryl, you know, really opened up about this a bit, but I wanted to like talk about it a little bit more, is that it's not just a women's magazine, it's a glossy. magazine. And one of the slogans is, "We want it all." This kind of exuberant, excessive demand that's already part of the, in the masthead. And I want you to talk some more about the insistence on luxury. Like, what does luxury mean? I mean, even the word, I mean, obviously the word is important to the magazine because it also evokes other figures. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the word lux, but part of it is really luxury, and it's really affirming it. And so there's one article in the first issue that I really loved by Jennifer Wilson on champagne socialism, what luxury looks like without rich people, which I thought was sort of kind of a really nice way of getting at the way you guys are kind of playing with this. And it offers this campaign for a Soviet perfume as not a contradiction in terms, Soviet, austere, perfume, luxury, but actually as a kind of suggestive metaphor or figuration of something you guys are trying to affirm. And so I guess, what is luxury to you, and how do you understand the importance of affirming luxury as a political project in this moment? I think it's a really, like, what are you reacting against? What are you gesturing towards with all of that? So could you talk a little bit about the desire for luxury and pleasure?
Yeah, it's very important to us, I think, that we be envisioning the lives we want to lead and not just the mitigation of the worst ills of society. There has to be something we actually want to move toward. And I think it's notable also that a lot of the things that are fundamental to especially women and queer folks' well-being are often described as luxuries. So, the inclusion of, abortion in healthcare, for example, it's like, that's something we can leave for a less politically fraught time. That's a bit controversial. It's not really fundamental to anyone's well-being. No. If you want to think about, I think thinking about a world of pleasure actually helps with this. So we have this long article that's an interview with Ariella Thornhill, who is writing a socialist sex ed book. And one of her points is actually, in order to experience pleasure in the way that you want, it really helps to have a house. It really helps to have access to healthcare. And in the US, she points out, we do a lot of talking about stigma, for example, the stigma of getting STD testing or an abortion. But the real problem that we have is there's no clinic down the block that's free. And so when we start thinking in terms of pleasure, we think, well, what is the infrastructure that would support not just our survival, but our pleasure? And that immediately starts to introduce things like healthcare, things like housing, and in a way that demands that those things actually be good, be of quality. And we have a piece also by Liza Featherstone about Alexandra Kollontai, who, part of her program was building, in her case, a state infrastructure that would support a new vision of gender relations and of family and so forth. And so I think framing things in terms of pleasure actually really opens up your imagination for what the concrete changes are that you would want to make. Imagination is really important. There's a really nice Angela Carter, who's a novelist who wrote these incredibly fanciful books, riffing on fairy tales. I saw her interviewed once, and the interviewer said, "So you say you're a socialist?" And she's like, "Yeah." She's like, "Well, you don't write gritty social realist novels." And she's like, "Yes, well, I don't think being a socialist is to want to recapitulate the world exactly the way it is right now." And I think we do try to live by that.
Yeah, I really strongly agree about how important pleasure is. and how important imagination is. And I'm really like upset because so many people don't have any imagination, or I mean, they have it, it's somewhere in there, like I believe in you, but like they're not like using it, you know, they're really willfully like ignoring imagination of like what should the world be like, what could the world be like. They're always just reacting against some big evil ill, but never like building. And I'm really a fan of a lot of abolitionist thought that has arisen relatively recently about the importance of framing abolition as like a building project, as like, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, a presence. That's what you're doing when you're doing abolition, not just like abolishing the actual just site of jails, prisons, the actual forces of police, but also creating a presence of like another world, something else, completely new, something else, which is what we're doing, supposedly. Socialists, you want to tear down capitalism, that's the entire world, babe, like that's the world. You want to create and birth a new world. So, I mean, start decorating the room. I don't know, have some imagination, figure it out. People are very, it seems sort of wary of like saying, what should we do? What should the world be like? How should we live in this world? What sort of world are we trying to like live for? And that world has to be one of pleasure. I mean, what would be the point otherwise? What are we running towards? What's the bright like horizon? And I think Lux is something that, a place when we hold like luxury and pleasure, I think that's the stuff that's in there, like living well as a socialist.
Yeah. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah, just to build on that, the question of imagination, I feel like a lot of people who are on the left who think about what they want after the revolution, it'll be things like, I want to pay off my college debt. I want enough money to buy a home. I don't want to have medical bills anymore. We want Medicare for all. But I think to us, it's taking it the next step, you know, assuming all of our basic needs are met, because there's so much wealth in this world. You know, we have men walking around who are trillionaires. So guaranteeing everyone not just the comforts of like a middle class life, but promising, you know, leisure, more time to spend with your family. I don't know, nice things, the ability to travel, which sounds utopian as I say it out loud, but I think it's luxury is about going beyond like these kinds of non-creative asks that some socialists put forward.
One of the big pleasures of like the last summer, I know it's weird to say there was pleasures there, but there was, in a way, when the riots broke out, the protests, it was great. I got out of my house again, and I was fighting with people that, you know, marching in the street, sometimes fighting cops in a way with people that I felt really kin to and like love for, and also some of my friends, and just to like hang out and have conversation, and also to have had like, many people were unemployed, like people didn't have jobs, and not having enough money would suck, but there was some unemployment insurance. So people had some money and they were unemployed and they had free time, and we were all out in the street together. And that was a real pleasure. And that's not what a lot of people think of when they think of luxury, but I do think that is like luxurious, this free time. What kind of world do I want to live in? Just having that and to be clear, it was very stressful because we were protesting, but I'm saying real pleasure in the fact that we were free, we had free time. We weren't necessarily immediately worried about rent, like as a group. Many people, you know, you had the rent freeze, you had unemployment insurance, and then to extrapolate that to like, what sort of life do I want to lead? Like, what is pleasurable in life? Like, to be able to have free time, yes, to not work so much, to like see my friends more. Like, that's a luxury. To be out on a warm day in New York and take like a walk, I've noticed this, the walk is like 75% more pleasurable. No, way more than that. When there's no cars around, it's great. Like, so now I'm like, we gotta get rid of this car, awful. You know, just, that's like luxury. The imagining like walking through New York City in a green space without cars, having free time to enjoy some sun with people who aren't stressed out about paying their bills and, you know, all that stuff. What kind of world that would be? Healthcare, that's like luxury. I feel fantastic when I had that sort of condition in my life. So I think that's what we're like defining. What does luxury mean? Like those things. Those are really luxurious. And most people they're luxurious because most people aren't getting those things also right now. So how do we get them? Like, I think this magazine is both presenting like a future that we'd like to have, and also presenting sometimes like ways that we are getting there, like the work we're doing to get there. How's that happening?
Yeah, I wanted to just pick up on that question, which addresses your query, Kathi, of why now. And I think, you know, Cheryl's comment is really astute in terms of this moment we're going through right now, where there's potentially a reevaluation of public goods, of our social welfare state, of, you know, the things that one wants and needs to survive and then to thrive on top of that. But I think, you know, our readers are primarily people who have only ever lived in these last 40 to 45 years of maximum austerity politics, who have only ever lived in a complete neoliberal global situation in which, you know, the idea of public goods and of making demands on the state in a cooperative and socially helpful and feminist way have all been extinguished, you know. And so I think it's exciting for us to be able to come in this kind of potentially a pivot moment out of that, you know, or to dream of something that isn't that, and to kind of, you know, yeah, just walk with our readers through that sort of thought experiment.
Well, but what about, so I'm just trying to like, I'm thinking about this in relationship to this there's a long socialist tradition of a kind of asceticism, you know, about being serious and not being utopian. And I really appreciate, you know, part of this luxury is the luxury of thinking what we might want, not just what we don't want. And that involves trying to connect with some sense of pleasure and want and desire. I mean, you have to do that. You can't shut that stuff down if you want to think about, you know, what comes after and what you want to build, not just what you want to defeat. But there's also like, I mean, I think, you know, with that left ascetic tradition, part of it is they're super worried about the seductions of consumer society. You know, so, you know, it's one thing, definitely, I love the idea of luxury being the luxury of free time and fresh air. You know, I mean, that's a really nice way to kind of take, you know, to shift the conversation of whether consumerism is good or bad and talk about other kinds of luxuries. But I'm interested in this question of consumerism. Are some of you or any of you anti-consumerist? Like, there is a kind of judginess about that, you know, about people's pleasures and the fact that people have pleasures that are not quite maybe up to snuff. I mean, there's a long tradition within feminism and within the left generally about, you know, insulting different people's pleasures. And yet you're embracing it, but that also must mean embracing, I don't know, pleasures that you don't necessarily want to write home about. Or, I mean, so how do you take the consumerism part? Because that was also what the old traditional magazines were selling. And obviously you're not, you know, you talk about featuring a good that is free, or you talk about the luxury of free time and solidarity and companionship. But what's your line on consumerism? I guess, you know, in relationship to this old problematic of the left, you know, being super worried about it, of the seductions of commodity fetishism and these, you know, and particularly that's a way that women have often been insulted. You know, on the one hand, they're, you know, expected to look certain kinds of ways and buy a lot of products to make them look certain ways, and then they're shamed for being trivial because they're interested in these things. It's always been this double-edged sword, this trap that women are put into, particularly as seen as consumerist in that way. And I'm just wondering what you do with any of that. I mean, in relationship to this affirmation of luxury and pleasure.
I feel like there were more seductions back in or they were like better seductions, maybe. Like, I don't know. Now, like Netflix is selling me a new movie every like 12 hours and they're all bad. Like, I feel like I've seen the best TV could offer me. Like, all the clothes fall apart after 48 hours. Like, we're not, like, this is not the consumerist society that like has seductions for us. Like, literally everything I buy falls apart. Like, every furniture piece I have is literally falling apart. Like, yes, you can buy, but like the pleasures aren't there, babe. Like capitalism has gone too far. Like buying's not even bringing me the pleasure. Like everything is shit. And so like, what's the point of buying this clothes? Like I asked someone, where do you buy like a sofa that wouldn't be like $7,000, but also wouldn't be cardboard? And no one could tell me. They said, buy an old sofa. I was like, so buy grandma's, so that's the only sofa that wouldn't fall apart or cost $8,000. This is capitalism now. That's consumerism. So the things we have to consume suck. So, I mean, they overplay their hands. That's why we're all socialists now. Look at this. I can't even consume in peace. If I could consume, if the seductions were there, maybe we would have a worry, but they're not there. Like they're just, I don't think it's there. So I don't think we actually have as much to be worried about because I don't think we have much to be seduced by consumerism wise.
I don't know. I have to disagree just a little bit. I feel like we do live in a very consumerist time in terms of like Amazon. I feel like people buy a bunch of crap that they don't even know what it is when it comes to their door. And that certain cultures of like buying cultures, certain like aspects of like buying things online has become very much like buy these things that you don't really need, that you wouldn't typically buy. And just like the mailing and the packaging of it leads to a ton of waste. I think it's really unhealthy and is bad for our planet. But in terms of whether or not we're anti-consumerist, I mean, I would say I'm personally anti-consumerist in that way. I don't shop from Amazon. I try not to use places that are known for using prison labor. But also to what Tammy said in the chat, I feel like we don't typically like, if someone buys something they're excited about, we're not going to be like, oh, your laptop, didn't it come from this? I don't want to make light of it, but there are kind of exploited practices around computers. So I don't know, those are my kind of complex, disorganized thoughts on that.
But I mean, that's just also the conditions of capital. I mean, most of these laptops, all of your smartphones, like made of terrible materials from like, I don't know, there's a line, right? Like there's, I think, anti-consumerism, but I mean, we can't be literally that meme, like you're typing this on an iPhone. Like we live within the conditions of capitalism. I do think we're not like consumers. I just don't think there's a lot, like if you're a socialist already and you're reading this magazine, then I don't think that us talking about like luxury is going to make you be like, I have an excuse for buying all the shit I want to buy. I don't think, I think because of the time that we're in and the way that you can't really consume quality type products anymore. That's exorbitantly expensive for most of us. So I also think like if you're not quite like an anti-consumerist, but you come to a magazine that frames pleasure in a different way, that doesn't have advertisements, we don't, or we have like, here's another socialist magazine, you want to read about more socialism? And I think that's probably as much as we'll do. I think that can only move you more towards a view of anti-consumerism. What is it like to read something that is beautiful, that has pleasurable materials, and that doesn't feature a bunch of like ads? You might think, wow, this experience is like so much better. Like, what's that all about? So I think presenting this, like talking about pleasure and luxury, we cannot be afraid of that. I don't think there's like, I'm not concerned about seduction of young communists thinking like, God, if I smell nice, then we're just not serious about socialism anymore. Yeah.
And also, I think in addition to that, it's just not part of our political analysis that the way that you change the world is by not buying an iPhone. That is not how our rough theory of change operates. we live in the world. Obviously, we use the tools of the world. It is always, there are always usually sort of liberal efforts to discredit left organizing by pointing out that left organizers use iPhones, even though they condemn the predations of Apple. And we all think, of course, that this is silly because organizing work has to take place in the time in which it takes place. I do think that, so I guess for that reason, anti-consumerist politics are just not the way we frame our politics. We have a variety of opinions about good and bad ways to engage in consumerism, given what we're dealing with. And any of us would cease to consume something, for example, at a place where the workers were boycotting. We exercise solidarity through consumption as much as in other ways. But individual consumer choices are not the hinge on which the left is going to swing. And I think also the idea that a sort of aesthetic attitude has been a way to consolidate power within the left and condemn women and other people who care about frivolous things. I think dispelling that is very, very helpful because, of course, we all have desires. It's good to acknowledge those, lest you be controlled by them in ways that you don't understand. And for a long time, women have been the sort of trash can in which usually men put all the desires they don't want to acknowledge, whether that's for pleasure or beauty or other values that women are disproportionately bound to uphold in society and condemned for upholding, but condemned for not upholding. And we're not really very interested in trying to appease those sorts of attitudes. And in fact, people who are not, who don't take their own desires seriously, who aren't willing to accept that all political organizing is a mix of Marx and Freud, are, I think, far more likely to get into trouble than people who acknowledge that everything we do is partly driven by our political analysis and also very much wrapped up with the things that we want as human beings. So, Marx and Freud, always.
That's a super hot take, Sarah. I feel like you dropped it really casually.
I mean, that's my truth.
Anybody else on the question of luxury and pleasure? I mean, because part of, and I guess that Sarah's answer of it has to be Marx and Freud, I guess, is important too. But there is a kind of, it's not just anti-consumerism, but there's a kind of anxiety about pleasures because our pleasures are shaped in the here and now, and they're always tainted. And I think that's where, to the extent that feminists in earlier eras got involved in kind of prescriptive judginess about people's desires, and are they feminist desires, are those socialist desires, are those desires we want, as if you could just say, oh, maybe not, I'll get rid of them now. And I think this, and so I also think that, and I read that affirmation of luxury and pleasure as a refusal, an aspiration to having different pleasures and desires that we might be able to cultivate, but not a kind of punitive policing of the desires that we might have now that, are maybe are not quite so, I don't know, laudable or something.
I think we all have those desires, of course, and under any conditions, you'll have those desires. I don't know. I think that the tragedy comes in not having a sense of humor about that. And if anything, the magazine does have a sense of humor about it. Why on earth would we try to condemn people for individual online purchases? That's not a politics. That's sort of making yourself feel better by being a bit mean. That's not serious. And I think, being able to have a sense of humor about the fact that you were raised with commercial magazines and commercial television, and therefore absolutely want to purchase something that even though you know it won't, you kind of think will make you feel amazing. That's our human condition under capitalism, and you have to laugh. It's impossible to get out of. And it's like, okay, we're always trying to solve the problem of how do we take our late capitalist subjectivity and corral it into some sort of organizing that can function. It's very, very challenging, but I don't think it can ever start from a place of condemnation. You can absolutely never organize anyone long-term by telling them they're stupid and weak and should like stop buying clothes. I mean, what could be less productive?
Yeah, I think you really, if you're like really angry about, I mean, some people are better people than me, I guess. I probably, you know, really good at refusing all of the desires that have been shaped by our terrible conditions, and fantastic. I have some shit to work out, and like there's a lot of stuff going on in my life sometimes, so occasionally you buy a hula hoop, it's, you know, stuff like that. I don't know, so some people cannot do it, and I think if they could help the rest of us not do it too, you know, like how do we build the things that would make it so that the maximum amount of people are not like are having, or their desires are being shaped by other forces in our society. Like what alternatives are there for many people for like Amazon? Like if you are mad about people using Amazon, can we work on building those alternatives? Like that's a more productive use of like your anger than like being pissed off at like one person who's buying from Amazon. You know, accept reality, reality of like people are struggling through their lives. That's what it is for most people. They're just like figuring out ways to live. People could be better, and I think we should all strive to like do better in many ways. As you develop your politics too, to like refuse to do certain things. There are things that, yeah, I won't buy, things that I won't do anymore, activities I won't partake in, as I've developed my politic. But when I'm mad about like what other people are doing, I'm like, how do I make it so that they won't do this? Like make it easier to not choose this choice. So essentially do the work, like reshape the structures.
Yeah, I want to add to this. I think we're all saying really important stuff here. And I wouldn't say that I'm anti-consumerist, but I do think that I love spending money. I think that it brings me joy, you know, and I'm a freelance art director, so I make almost no money. And what the money that I do have, like buying perfume, to me, that's visually pleasurable. I love buying my friends' drinks at the bar, you know, like I think that money should be spent. And I don't know, I grew up with this sort of maybe immigrant scold, like you shouldn't waste your money, you should save your money. For what? I mean, I'm not, what am I going to do? Invest in something or the other? Like to me, like it feels like if we're truly going to live in like late capitalism, I might as well just spend my money.
There's actually an incredible Natalia Ginsburg essay called The Little Virtues, where she talks about how you should not teach your children the little virtues like thrift. You should teach them the big virtues, like money's not important. And she basically said exactly what you just said, Sharanya, which is like, the money should be spent, keep it moving. Like, you know, you want to like move it through the community, spend it out. And yeah, it echoes exactly what you just said.
The only reason to save money, I should say, is if you want to buy something expensive.
So I'm going to change gears and ask, so this is, I guess this is the, I don't know, the feminist theory question, the feminist politics question that comes up for me. But so you all declare that the era of the girl boss is over. You know, that the meaning, like, I guess that the model of feminism that kind of concentrates on linking arms so we can go break the glass ceiling that stops women and people of color from rising to the very tops of the job hierarchies, that version of feminism is either failed or just completely uncompelling version of feminism, even though I think it is still the most media visible version of feminism. And I guess so the question is it, I guess one question is it really over? Is there more to be gained from what I would call the larger project of liberal feminism? That kind of takes the individual as the unit of analysis and tries to gain equal opportunities for that individual to rise up the economic and political and social hierarchies, that seeks, women and people of color's full inclusion, assimilation into the existing social structures. I mean, that's how I think of liberal feminism. So some people have said, well, that's, add and stir feminism. Take liberalism, take capitalism and democracy, add women and stir. But that stirring always stirs things up too. I don't think it's ever quite so simple that it's completely assimilationist. I mean, trying to assimilate people into it always disrupts it in some way. So, I mean, again, I think liberalism is sometimes, this is something Zila Eisenstein said a long time ago, that there's a radical impulse or future of liberal feminism too, that I think is worth taking into account. But obviously, you guys are banking on a much more collective model of feminism with a much more transformative rather than, assimilationist political agenda and vision. So do you see liberal feminisms as allies, as foes, as something else? I mean, how would you describe your take on this? I guess the girl boss is the low-hanging fruit of this larger thing that I'm calling liberal feminism, which is a long-standing feminist analysis and political agenda that has got us certain things and certain goods. Is it over? Should it be over? What? I just find that kind of a big and important question right now, and I'm just kind of wondering how any of you are thinking about that.
I think the girl boss is probably not dead. She's unfortunately just born. I think we're at the start of this. But I don't know. I think that we've had a lot of conversations about this. I mean, I don't know if anyone's seen the latest CIA ad where their recruitment tactic to sort of co-opt the language, I think that has been used on the left to make people, in inclusive communities, to make people feel included and part of something. So I'm not sure that what feels like it's selling positivity and equality can't be co-opted to actually create chaos and violence.
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you should go first.
I think one of the things about liberal feminism, as it's been spearheaded by the sort of girl boss types, is that it's very unsatisfying to the people who practice it and very, talk about not pleasurable. I mean, it's like, well, you too could work 19 hours a day and sleep under your desk. Like, don't you want that? And it's a measure of how powerful capitalist ideology is, that people can be made to want that. I mean, it sounds horrible. And, one of the things about Lean In as a book, which I dutifully read in order to critique it, was, this is an encouragement to somehow both be really nice to everybody while asserting yourself, but also work incredibly hard, but also be nice to your family. And it's just literally impossible. You're supposed to do everything at the same time and like it. It's horrible. And I think one of the interesting things that we've seen, I've worked in sort of lefty media institutions, but across the industry, a lot of people have organized within big companies on the basis of sexism or racism within hiring and promotion practices, for example. So in theory, a sort of integrationist model, a sort of add and stir model. And a lot of the time what people discover is they have no power within their workplaces. And actually, I heard a really good discussion of this on Tammy's podcast, Time to Say Goodbye. I thought there was an especially good discussion of this. And folks end up wanting to unionize, to have some amount of power. And so when I think of a project like Lux, it's like, you know, there are always going to be things that socialist and liberal feminists have in common, like support of reproductive rights, for example, which are very, very important. And we have different theories of how to get there, but that allyship, I think, actually is somewhat important. But if we truly believe that politics is going to prove unsatisfying to a large number of people, we have to be offering something different for them to step into. And I think Lux is trying to provide something that actually is much more satisfying.
I was gonna say foes. Just because I don't know there are foes doesn't mean they aren't, in my view. I think liberal feminism is very carceral. And as Sarah says, it's always going to lead to pretty unsatisfactory outcomes. I agree that like it's not as easy as assimilation. Things have changed because of certain things that liberal feminists have done, but in certain but I don't know. I think about like where have we really gone with like stuff like beauty discourse, or where have we really gone in like dismantling like systems? Where have we really gone in these conversations? Like liberal feminism hasn't taken us anywhere there. Where have we really gone? Like, okay, the Me Too movement has happened, and like there has been this co-optation of this movement, definitely by liberal feminists who have made it something where you'll like call someone out and maybe something happens sometimes it doesn't, and then no structure, that individual is the like horrible person, and there's focus on like, will something happen like to this person, the best thing that could happen, like will they go to jail, and everything else doesn't change. Like what like enabled like this culture like hasn't really shifted as much as like a focus on like who is maybe going to get fired and sometimes doesn't even. So now it's just like we've identified that no one gives a shit, and we're outraged. But what is the mechanism of like change here? Or like maybe we did get to send someone to jail, prosecution, which is carceral. And as an abolitionist, I just disagree with this like carcerality that seems very built into liberal feminism. Yeah, and hasn't meaningfully addressed like the conditions that need to be changed. So, and I think diverts a lot of people's energy. And I guess that's why I call it a foe, because I think this diversion of like useful energy, productive outrage that people sometimes have around the conditions of this society, which are bad, like that's productive. That outrage that you have at first is productive to be directed somewhere. And often these things are being directed in liberal feminism by like performative displays, by, getting people to clap at stuff like that CIA ad, like crazy, like, wow, amazing. You too now are at the top of like one of the worst institutions ever to exist. Great, fantastic. But directing people's like outrage and people's like desire and hope for like change into those venues are very destructive and make them foes in my head. So yeah, I think the girl boss, I agree, Sharanya. I think maybe we aspire for the girl boss to be dead, but is not currently, actually, but we are not afraid chucking this thing over the cliff. That's our aspiration, I think. Yeah.
But Kathy, I wonder a little bit when you were setting up the question. I mean, what is the counter? I feel like, to us, and I'm sure to you, that liberal feminism doesn't really seem like it has much to offer because it is so individual over collective. And Nancy Fraser talks about this term, which I'm sure you know, but progressive neoliberalism. And she wrote that great essay after Hillary Clinton lost, talking about how feminism has kind of become the handmaiden of capitalism. So I'm curious to know what you view as like the other side when you were posing the question. I guess I couldn't really follow on onto that part.
You mean the good side of liberal feminism?
Yeah, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I don't identify as one, and my entire career has been about critiquing them. So I don't. And my whole intellectual formation has been anti-liberalism. I mean, essentially, it started with Marxism and came in with feminism. And so, but on the other hand, I guess I was just trying to sort of recognize that, all of these, I don't know, I think all of these formations are just a lot more internally complex. So you can describe a liberal feminist on paper, but on the ground, I think people are always kind of mixtures in some ways. And I actually do think we're so trained and we're so good about thinking about the individual. And that makes so much sense to us just because our whole daily life, we've been taught to think about ourselves as individuals with this model of a kind of, I don't know, not necessarily competition, but an individual goal that individuals are striving for. And this model where we're really good at seeing individuals, and then we see, well, individuals are blocked from rising to a certain status given their innate talents. And we see that, but we're not very good at seeing social structures because they're not visible to us. We haven't been trained in thinking about them. Right. So we can think about, individual racism. Okay, got that. Structural racism. That's been an education, and people have had to really work in a society like ours to think in this structural level. So I guess I think liberal feminism in some ways is a default. Like, when Betty Friedan, who exactly wrote Lean In, I mean, it's the same book, right? The Feminine Mystique and Lean In, they're the same book. They're just later, right? And I think, Betty Friedan was not a theorist or philosopher. She didn't know she was being a liberal feminist, but of course it just made sense in her context, the importance of the individual and this ideal of equal opportunity and democracy just resonated for her, and she expected it to resonate for her audience. And so I just think that the legacy of liberal feminism is part of I identify as a Marxist feminist, but for me, liberal feminism is part of the context I am in this society. And part of me, I am an anti-liberal, but I still want to take it seriously and try to sort of recognize its attractions to certain kind of people. And so, I guess I think of it as a foe in some ways, but it's a foe that I'm trying to recognize for its complexities and for the inherent contradictions that might lead it more to something more radical, right? Because as you're saying, it never works. It doesn't get you anywhere. It might get you somewhere, but everyone else is back in the dust. It's a false promise to begin with, and yet it's a promise that sort of makes so much sense to us on a day-to-day level. So I guess it's a foe that I take very seriously and approach very lovingly. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, even as you were speaking, one of the things I said at the beginning is that I like that Lux can be an entry point, and I think Sarah made this point. But we want the liberal feminists to read our mag and think, oh yeah, this is a little bit stronger. So yeah, wonderfully put. Thanks for that, Kathy.
In our first issue, we have an essay by Raina Lipsitz about having worked at a liberal feminist nonprofit and coming out of that, getting politicized through that process to end up on the other side. So that's very much kind of what you're talking about, Kathy. And I think also, I see liberal feminists as a group that can be organized. I think that's part of this work too, that not all of them are hardcore Sheryl Sandbergians or whatever, like some of them are asking those questions of all of these promises, all of these, failed promises of the second wave, all of this stuff happening in my workplace, none of this makes sense. So they're looking for answers, and we're trying to provide those answers. That sounds haughty, but you know what I mean.
So maybe this is a question. Why socialism? Why socialism, not Marxism, not communism, not, I don't know. Well, I was gonna say democracy, but let's just stick with why socialism and not Marxism or, I don't know, communism, I guess. I mean, what is that word? Is it just kind of more capacious, kind of open-ended in some ways? I mean, there was this moment in the history of US feminism where some of them, just described themselves as socialist feminists in opposition to the Marxist feminists who were much more tied to an orthodox Marxism. And they wanted to kind of distinguish themselves and have something that was more open, maybe to non-Marxists and certainly to non-orthodox Marxists. And so they used socialism as more capacious. I don't know. So I don't know how I feel about the term, but how do you guys feel about it? I mean, what was that? Was there a debate about that term? Is there a sense of kind of possibility that's opened for you by that concept? Why socialism?
I guess, I think we're in a moment where socialism has become the chosen terminology of a fairly large and radical movement in American politics, the most radical we could have hoped for. I remember asking the writer Kate Aronoff maybe a couple years ago, lots of people say, why call it socialism when it seems like half the time Bernie's just talking about the New Deal, why this particular term? And she was like, because that's the term we're using. This is the term that has sparked people's imagination and appealed to people as something that they understand to be to the left of Democrats, more radical than the things that have been on offer. And a lot of, people have kind of moved backwards into defining its meaning, which I don't necessarily think is bad. And it is a fairly capacious term at this point. A lot of people have pointed out that maybe it's appealing to a lot of people because Republicans called Obama a socialist for 8 years. And so the term really lost its sting in the mainstream. Maybe that's part of it. I don't know. But it does seem to work for people. And so, and it does, I mean, for me personally, other people have different opinions. For me personally, it describes my politics well, in that it's both anti-capitalist and somewhat open-ended. I think people in the group will disagree with me, but I think sometimes communism for people evokes something that was tried and failed, which is like, you could argue about whether that's fair, but I think sometimes that is what it provokes for people. And I think Marxism, to me, Marxism is like an extremely important tool of analysis, one of my primary tools of analysis, but I think it's also something that is obscure to many people for whom, that's not the way that they arrived at their socialism. So that's sort of where I come from on it, I think.
Yeah, I identify as a communist, but a small c communist. And I 100% hear what Sarah's point about communism having this name. And I definitely don't think we call ourselves socialists because, well, we know that some of us are in the DSA. I met Sarah and Cheryl through DSA, and DSA has a pretty anti-communist start. It was Michael Harrington trying to provide to water down socialism in a way that was acceptable, and DSA still has a little bit of a taint around that. But so I feel like we're not doing that with our use of socialism. My understanding was kind of that socialist feminism is kind of a school of thought, and Kathi, you of course know the history there, but I feel like we're a part of that tradition that exists. But for me, yeah, I identify as a communist. I know other people on this call do, and I want to out the other communists. But I think that we disagree on what level of centralization we want. That's a question I don't want to be pinned down on. But yeah, I want full communism. I'd like to live in a somewhat centrally planned society. So.
I love, Marian, that you said we're not gonna out people. Like, if they're gonna write you on a list, you're already on it. So I think it's probably fine. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a term that people are attracted to. It's a term that is broad. I'm a communist, and I think that whatever in this way, like this term, makes it clear that we're not liberal feminists, it makes it clear, so that's what we're rejecting. And is also like opening the door to people is good. It's fine. Yeah, trying to move people along. And I don't know, maybe some people, I don't know why the word, I definitely don't feel the like the scare quotes around communists. And I wonder if it's because I really truly like do not think I ingested enough propaganda when I was young or something. I don't know. Like I hadn't read any theory. Like I was really like coming in fresh, like into like, as I came into politics, like with communism being one of my first like forays into like having political opinions. So maybe I'm unable to see it, but I think there's a lot of people like that out there now. A lot of young people are now coming into this, I think, with less and less, definitely less like scare quotes around socialists and increasingly less around like communists too. I just don't see it as like we're worried about it. And in fact, find it attractive. So.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a generational thing. For me, I feel like I came to my I was a feminist first and my undergrad was on the study of women and gender, and then became a socialist, I'd say, after I came to the city, but was always really open to the role class played and the oppression of, gender oppressed folks.
Okay, here's my last question. And this is, I just went and talked about how I'm raised as a sort of anti-liberal individualist. And yet here I'm going to ask, I'm still really curious about you as individuals, because we've talked a lot about Lux as a collective project, and also had some really interesting ideas about how you have some of these, really generative kinds of debates among you. And so it's not a centralized party line that you're all following. And I just wanted to know something about you as an individual. So I was just wondering if each of you could say something about like what brought you to Lux? Like, how do you consider, like, how would you define what you're bringing to Lux that would encapsulate where you've been before this? You know what I mean? Like, what are your particular sort of interests or work background, or however you want to cast it, your political kind of orientation or organizing experience, whatever it is, however you want to cast it, your education, whatever it is that brought you to Lux, yes, I kind of want to know something about who you are that brought you into this, rather than focusing on the it, as we've been doing for this conversation.
No one wants to go first. What brought me to Lux, or to like, what brought me to Lux? Rank nepotism. No, I know Marian through organizing together. And she introduced me to Sarah and to the rest of Lux. So that's how I came to Lux. But I guess when I started organizing with the DSA first, and met Marian shortly thereafter. Came in through political education. I'm a Southerner who came to New York City to go to college, the worst college. I made bad decisions when I was young. You shouldn't let 17-year-olds make decisions about like how much debt they'll take on, because they'll decide to go to college in like another state they've never been to and take on horrendous amounts of debt. And so I came out of college and was from a family that had like, no one went to college. So was really like unprepared for, and also I'm from the South. I had never left like the South before I came to New York. So this whole experience was like jumping into another world. And to come into like adult life with truly very uncertain feet into this city that I was still not like totally like at home at, especially New York, where everyone's like, you're not a New Yorker until you've lived here for 1 million bajillion years. Like, you gentrifier. I don't, like really having to like navigate being this person and seeing how like this college education had like taken me in a certain like class position away from a lot of my family in Alabama, while at the same time seeing my class position like in relative to, I mean, I'm in the richest city in like the richest country in the world. Like this was like an education just in life. So I'd had like a lot of life education about race and race as class in Alabama, but it wasn't until I came to New York, and I'm very specifically now in a very different class of people, meaning all different sorts of like formations of class and working that through. And so it took a long time though in New York before I had enough money that I had free time to start organizing. And when I had enough free time, I already was like a person who had, I guess, a feeling of like, I agree with socialism because I hate working for little pay. Like this shit is bullshit. Like really, the feeling was strong already before I came to like the formal politics. And through the reading group, I met Marian, which is great. And we did reading groups together through the Socialist-Feminist and DSA. And through that, I came to like abolition and started doing abolitionist organizing and started a group that sort of broke off from the DSA, Abolition Action. Things really just like rapidly progressed. This whole world opened up for me. So it's like socialism and organizing has really brought this whole like next phase of my life. Like my life stopped being about like, how do I survive? And really like, how do I like build the world I want to live in? It was really transformative. And so that's how I came to Lux.
I'll go next. I work as a full-time journalist, and so I came to Lex through Journalism Friends like Sarah. But I guess my sort of personal contributions would probably be from the kind of labor side and maybe a bit of the international side. I had a first career as a social justice lawyer and primarily represented immigrant workers in cases against their bosses for unpaid wages, and got really politicized through, I think, personal experiences coming from working class immigrant family and then coming through that work, and have since been really active in the labor movement. So I think my ties there are fairly strong. And then I also write a fair amount about the Koreas. So we were joking a disproportionate amount of Korea content because there's also another person who has an academic interest in Korea on our volunteer staff. But yeah, and I this is the first sort of editorial project I've been involved with that is really focused on women and on socialism. And although I've written for a lot of left places, I don't think I've ever been part of a kind of left community that is constructed through a magazine. So that's very exciting for me.
I can go next. I think this is really starting to shape up to see how we all come from different places. But my interest in Lux was actually purely editorial at first. I came in because I am a left-leaning, obviously, but have experience as a designer working in books and publications, and was actually, very much seeking a project like this. Like, I think that being a graphic designer is it's a very strange occupation because you do a lot of work. And I think we give ourselves a lot of self-importance in how movements are sometimes made and passed, but really at the end of the day, it's pretty arbitrary, I think. You know, I mean, I brought up the CIA before, and they've rebranded to look very, very nice, but what is the point of that? And, you know, what kind of designer is hired to do a project like that? So I think, you know, that being said, on the opposite end of that, I came into this because I saw that there is a growing interest in socialism. And I think that the language around socialism was something that needed to be explored. You know, our previous conversation about socialist feminist being the sort of umbrella term of politics that we very much need is starting to attract people. And then coming at it from like an aesthetic perspective, you know, I think everything that we've been talking about today, like, I don't think that a socialist future necessarily is austere or gray and needs to focus entirely on pure philosophy or theory. You know, I think that there needs to be like a new visual language around it. So my interest in the project came purely from that, and has been growing since then. I mean, earlier we were, you know, we sort of in passing had mentioned even the way that we think about photographing people, I think like has really opened a new level of thought, because, you know, a lot of magazines, especially when they do profiles on people, will focus on the subject in this sort of what feels like borrowed from aristocratic ways. You know, they're posed very regally, they have their makeup and kind of like glamour, and this is like aura of status around it. And approaching this from like a left perspective, I was thinking about how to deconstruct something like that. You know, like how do we empower women or make people that would not normally get like a front, you know, the front cover feel like glamorous in a way that doesn't traditionally feel that way. So I don't know, it's been like a really interesting process, a growing process for all of us to sort of figure out how to do this a little bit. Yeah.
Oh, I can go next. Yeah, like everyone else, I met Sarah through DSA, and she mentioned wanting to start a magazine to me a few times, and was just really friendly about wanting me to get involved. And I was really intimidated at first. Like, we met for drinks once, and you were telling me all about it, and we're so excited. And we're in the back of my head thinking maybe, because I also was and still am in some ways just really intimidated by Sarah. I remember doing a reading group with her. We did Capital, and we did an introduction to Socialist-Feminism reading group, and just thinking she was the smartest. And I didn't know she was a writer at first. I remember later reading an article that an op-ed she did in the New York Times that people were sharing around. And then that's how I found out that Sarah was this really established, accomplished writer. So then, but yeah, then she approached me again, and Natalie, our other friend, I asked her to come along because Natalie's also a writer and really talented, and I'd be less intimidated. Then I also got my buddy Cheryl to join. So that's how I came to Lux, and I was really attracted to the project for all the reasons Sarah said. She wanted to make this really fun, accessible, good-looking, good-looking, I guess, magazine. So.
I actually told Marian I would buy her a drink if she just made me look cool on this call. Also, I feel like what you didn't say, Marian, is you basically took over political education for the Socialist-Feminists, which was like a very relevant thing to making a magazine that was meant to politically educate people.
Marian is like responsible for like all of the political, like she for a while, like the best and most of the political education that New York City DSA was doing. And these reading lists are still incredibly popular that she's created.
They're so good. Yeah, and I guess like, I don't know. Yeah, the magazine's like a really good excuse to hang out with the people on this call, but I think when I was first working at Dissent, when I was sort of right out of college and at this very small and at the time like kind of of sleepy leftist magazine. You know, I started doing a reading group with some other people who wanted to read Capital without any, this sounds sort of essentialist now, but without any men like explaining it to us. And so we made a Marxist reading group to do that. And then that sort of started affecting the articles I commissioned. We started reading a lot of feminism. And it seemed to me that a lot of the socialist and Marxist feminism that existed was not being transmitted. Like, we really had to dig for it. Like, none of us had learned it in school. None of us were learning it in our political organizations. It wasn't really present at political magazines. The books were out of print. It was, you know, like all the Italian feminism, like most of it was untranslated. I mean, it was crazy. And so I think I always had in the back of my head, you know, this stuff needs to be transmitted. And, you know, this is like valuable information. It needs to be communicated in some way. And we need to have these resources to work with if we want to do our political work. And then during the Hillary-Bernie primary, you know, I felt like you had liberal feminism on one side and sort of leftist bros on the other, in this way that, of course, some of those distinctions were made up, you know, in order to win or foment conflict, but some of it was true. And I was like, the only politics I care about will be crushed by, you know, people having to choose between being a liberal feminist or like a male Marxist who can't even begin to understand why seeing a woman on television is important to some people, you know? And so I think I was really curious, like, can we build something that is neither of those things and that actually speaks to the political constituency that, like, I consider myself a part of, and develop a better politics.
So I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you for that and for the brilliant conversation. And also, you're going to have so much fun on that first retreat, because I have to tell everyone too that there's this hilarious chat going on between everyone during all of this too. So it's going to be an exciting retreat, I'm sure. And I urge everyone to go to the website and subscribe to Lux, because we all want everything and we all deserve it. So, and we deserve luxury and pleasure. So please subscribe to the magazine and it'll make you very happy. So Philip?
I second that. It's a very exciting project. We can't really say that there's enough work being done on the left side on pleasure and luxury. I think of when André Breton joined the Communist Party in the 30s, the first thing they did to him was they asked him to go to a factory and collect factory statistics instead of sort of doing the thing that you know how to do, but making it communist and making it part of it. I think that's the mistake that the left has done by trying to cut people into a particular mold of what the good comrade is, or how a serious, you know, and the great thing is that also, in addition to doing a magazine for us, you've created a community for yourselves where you can think together, which obviously at Red May, we identify with totally and salute. And I hope that in the future, we will be doing more stuff together, either as a whole or individually with some of you in other discussions. So I will now say goodbye to the audience and quickly clue you into what's coming up. We have a panel coming up at 6 p.m. called Theorizing the Present, the Foresight of Black Communist Women, with Charisse Burden-Stelly, Jody Dean, and Ashley Farmer as the moderator. What have we got tomorrow morning, Beam? Is it somewhere I can, whoops, I can see it. Let me see if I can make that a little higher. For some, I see, when I talk, it's not showing up. I know that tomorrow at, is it at 2 p.m. we have the Paul Ryder and Paul North talking about their new translation of Capital. Anyway, I know that at 11 a.m. we have the Paris Commune, which is presented by Spectre Journal. We'll have Zach Levinson as the moderator and have Stathis Kouvalakis and Carolyn Eichner, both of who have written excellent work on the Commune. And then what do we got at 5? No. Neither vertical nor horizontal? Oh, that must be Sunday. All right, anyway, the thing I will say is go to our website. It's all down there, www.redmayseattle.org. If you're watching this, you're adults. You can click with your finger and donate and give something to us. Bye-bye, everybody. I'll see you in about an hour.
Will you let us thank everybody?
Please do thank you.
Okay, we just had to get this in because we had a really good time, and we really wanted to thank Red May, which is an amazing project with so many of our comrades and so many good discussions that we now get to listen to. We wanted to say a special thank you to Kathi Weeks for moderating and asking us such amazing questions, and that was really fun for us. We wanted to thank you, Phil, for sort of wrangling all of us, which we appreciate and need. And to also thank Mahim for sort of wrangling the organization of everything. And also to Stephen and also to Sean. So we just want to say thank you, and we love the Red May project. And
well, you're welcome, and stick around for something because I have a present for you. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. We'll see you at 6.